Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call this meeting to order, please. Good afternoon. Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome to the first Budget and Finance Committee meeting of 2017. We're ready to begin with our agenda. And first, Mr. Williams, are there any general public comment cards?
No, sir, there are no cards.
All right, general public comment is closed. And I would have offered items 8 and 9 as potential consent candidates members, but we do have a card on item number 9. So I'd like to go ahead and, first of all, are there any cards on item number 8?
No, sir, no cards.
Are there any cards other than this one card on item number 9?
No other
any other agenda items? Okay, so I'm going to close comment on all of the agenda items except for item number 9. And I'd like to invite Hal Lewis to come on up and speak on item number 9. Good afternoon, sir.
Good afternoon and Happy New Year to everyone.
Thank you.
I did not plan on actually speaking today until I got here. My name is Hal Lewis. I own Leaf of Life Wellness, which is a collective cooperative under state guidelines for the state of California. I was issued an L050 tax permit, which we've been paying our taxes on. That tax permit was just revoked, and then 178 L050s were issued. My question to Mr. Wesson, the Honorable Mr. Wesson, was why was 178 when there wasn't 178 legal shops under GLACA or for the cannabis sector? So my question would be for this council, why is there 178 L050s been reissued, and what happened to the good people that are actually paying their taxes, the good players? I only deal with maybe 4 to 12 patients a month, senior citizens, people at the end of the stage of life. I don't own a weed shop where we sell weed to everybody. We deal with specific diseases only. So that is one of my things. And then I saw traceability. I know I'm out of time now, but traceability. We also own a company through Cannabis Sativa Inc., which is Gary Johnson's old company, Senator Mike Revelle, Judge Jim Gray, with iBud Tender, which we do seed trackability, seed to sell. So thank you very much.
Very good. Thank you very much, sir. So, members, with that, if there's no objection, I'd recommend approval of items 8 and 9. And I'd like to add on item 9 the request that the committee report should specify that the report back would be due on March 1st, 2017. Are there any concerns or questions about those
I'm
matters?
sorry, could you repeat the date, sir?
Yes, March 1st, 2017 for the report back on item number 9.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and if there's no objections or discussion on those items, that will be the action of the committee. That will bring us into our closed session. So we're going to take item number... All right, we are back now in open session. Thank you all very much for your patience, and to those who I didn't see before, Happy New Year. Mr. Williams.
On item number 6, the committee's action in closed session was to approve the city attorney's recommendation to approve the recommendation for outside counsel.
All right, thank you. And that brings us to our last remaining item, item number 7. And so I'd like to ask Mr. Santana to come forward for the very last time to the Budget and Finance Committee.
Yes.
At least for the very last time as CAO.
Yes.
Mr. Santana, welcome.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I hate to be a Debbie Downer on my last Budget and Finance meeting, but we felt it was important to alert you of concerns that our office has regarding the current fiscal year budget. It should not be a surprise to your committee because we have been forecasting these challenges in the various FSR reports. And to put it simply, what are the drivers? The drivers are really our increased liabilities, which I think you see firsthand as the body that's responsible for the direct oversight over these cases.
Legal liabilities.
Legal liabilities, correct. There are more cases that have been settled or where we've had verdicts than what was budgeted in our liabilities account. There's not one single enormous case like we've experienced in previous years, such as the May Day Melee or others. There's a series of smaller cases, with the largest being the settlement of the independent living case. On the revenue side, we're seeing a trend of revenues below what was budgeted for reimbursement from the special funds. Right now, it's about $70 million. There's the transfer for the current fiscal year is smaller than what was budgeted for a number of reasons. And so combined, based on the information we have today, we're anticipating a deficit well over $200 million for the current fiscal year. That's the worst case scenario. We're anticipating that it could be resolved through a number of different efforts. Once we're seeing increase in TOT revenues, in part due to the agreement with Airbnb to ensure that we're getting paid for the full TOT. That's trending higher than what was originally budgeted. And then we're hoping that we'll start getting our receipts from our revenue through the special funds. But even with those scenarios, what we're proposing is that your council direct a number of efforts to try to ensure that we end the year in the black, as we always do, and as important, that we protect our reserve fund, which your committee has fought hard to try to maintain at the level in our own policy. So there's a number of recommendations that we have before you to try to control our spending, specifically to start putting a halt on any new spending programmatic proposals that departments may present to you. We're recommending that those be analyzed in the context of the budget for fiscal year 17-18. And if there is one that is something that you feel is urgent, that it be kept to the very bare minimum. We're also asking not the reintroduction of managed hiring. We're not proposing that, but rather that we are mindful of the kind of hiring that we're doing and try to prioritize it in those areas that are revenue generating or consistent with other citywide goals that have been set by the mayor and the council, such as ensuring that we meet our sidewalk expenditure program, ensure that we fulfill our obligation around the homeless initiative that your council approved. We're also recommending, in order to ensure that we continue to expand our revenue streams, that Department of Finance establish agreements similar to Airbnb with the other home sharing, short-term home housing programs that exist. That we instruct the council instruct rather, that we continue to look at other revenue sources, such as potential revenue coming from billboards on public property. And that we are very careful of looking at any initiative that seeks to siphon off a general fund source and spend it for a particular purpose, because the general fund are precious dollars. We want to make sure that those dollars go into the general fund, and if there's going to be an appropriation towards a specific program, that be done through the budget process as it normally has been done. And then finally, we are also recommending that you direct my office to work with the city attorney to seek judgment obligation bonds between 50 and 70 million to help cover the costs associated with some of these cases. The reason why that's important, particularly today, or to provide that direction, it takes the shortest, fastest process to issue the judgment obligation bond is about 6 months. We're already slightly behind that. So if our intent is to pay off these settlements and reimburse the reserve fund to try to keep it at 5%, we do need a source to do that. As you know, it's not often that I've come to you and made a recommendation for judgment obligation bonds. I think this is the first time since I've been here that I've done so. But what we're trying to reconcile are two priorities. One is maintaining a reserve fund of at least 5%, and the second is to control the amount that we borrow. And when you weigh both of those different priorities, the different policies that your committee has established, the reserve fund trumps the other. And so we are recommending that in this case, we actually issue judgment obligation bonds. They get paid off over a 10-year period. And at an interest rate that will be determined when we go to market, but most likely would be in the neighborhood about 3 to 4%. To do so, we need that direction now, and it will take through the rest of the fiscal year to be able to do all the necessary work, including going through a validation process that requires court action to give us the authorization to go to market. So we have an aggressive schedule that we've presented to you to try to get the bonds issued before the end of the fiscal year. That would ensure that we maintain the reserve fund at 5%. If we don't do that, then it is not only very likely, it will be in fact the situation where the reserve fund will be below 5% at the end of the year to pay this off. Now, the cautionary note around judgment obligation bonds is that in order to ensure that we're not confronting with another round of judgment obligation bonds next year, it is our office's recommendation that we continue to appropriately fund our liability account. This year was funded at $60 million. Last year was funded at $60 million. In both years, we've had to augment those accounts. As you proceed through the budget process, I could guarantee that my office will continue to advocate for a larger appropriation or budget for liabilities that's, probably twice as big as what has been budgeted over the last 2 years. That's certainly the trend rate of what we've been spending. If that in fact occurs next year, then the city will not be in the same situation to have to consider judgment obligation bonds in fiscal year 17-18. So with that, Ben and I are prepared to answer any questions.
Okay, so I want to start, if I can, with the JO bonds, because I get that there's these competing priorities. But for the last 5 years or so, as we've tried to build up the reserve, the discussion in this committee has always been, and in council, has not been so much about meeting some arbitrary financial goal, but rather it's been an actual, there's been a value proposition. We've said, if you get to a certain level of reserve, we'll save money on interest payments and so on, and that's quantifiable. So now that we're looking at issuing JO bonds in order to avoid going below our financial goal, I'd want to spend a little time trying to do the reverse of that. So the JO bonds will cost the city money. They will cost interest payments at a market rate. That's real dollars that we don't want to spend. If, conversely, we were to drop below the 5% reserve goal, that will have a financial impact on the city as well. And I know this is probably difficult, it's more difficult to quantify the latter than the former, obviously, but I think it's important for us to understand that context and to try to quantify that a little bit. So that's number one on the JO bond, which ends up costing us more, dipping into the reserve or issuing a new bond. That's number one. Number two, and you've already touched upon this, I don't think it's ever a good idea to use credit to pay for ongoing expenses. And if this is an unusual uptick in liability expenses, at one big unusual case, it makes sense to spread that over the years. But if we are under budgeting what we actually expect to be spending in liability expenditures over the course of the next years, it does not make sense to borrow to pay for what we should be budgeting for. So you've already kind of addressed to that. I think the answer to that question will depend in large part on fully analyzing the data that we've requested from the city attorney's office to show the trend lines on claims, settlements, judgments, and so forth that we've been asking for and working with the city attorney to develop. So can you speak to those issues a little bit more fully, please? The relative cost and, you know, the deeper policy question about whether this is really kind of a one-time expenditure because of unusual expenses, or is it a regular, ongoing, structural expense that we just need to budget for and not borrow for?
Sure. So, you know, let's assume for a second the interest rate is about 3%. So at $50 million, you're talking about a $15 million cost, right, if that's how much we were to borrow. And so, and then we'll have to do the math to determine over time the compounding of that, but that's a bare minimum amount. And so that's evaluated against what would be a risk to our bond rating should we go below the 5%. You know, if you read our bond rating reports, the reason why we've been upgraded from all of the bond rating agencies is that number one is that we have these conversations, right? The city is very transparent about its finances and publicly discusses these trade-offs. And believe it or not all municipal governments do that. And so they're paying attention right now, probably listening in as we're speaking. And so, and when we do so, your body discusses, establishes not only the goal of meeting all of your policies, but has demonstrated that you're willing to do it. And those been difficult annual budget decisions. And so the fact that the city meets all of its financial policies, every single one, which, you know, when I first got here, that wasn't the case, is part of the reason, a significant reason why we've been upgraded. And when you combine that, the fact that our revenues, even though part of our deficit is being created due revenue shortfalls, it's in the context of all of our revenues growing. Property taxes up, sales taxes up, our economy has recovered, and so we're operating in the margins. So our bond rating is both based on things we can't control, like the economy, and things we can control, like meeting our own policies, and making sure that we're being transparent and consistent in how we monitor our budget. So given that, is there a risk that we would get downgraded should we dip below our policy for 5%? In isolation, very unlikely, unless there was a chronic decline down below. So in the next fiscal year, if the city year budget does not reflect a minimum 5%, then it starts showing that you've retreated from a steadfast a commitment to that policy. But there are things that we can't control, like the economy, and none of us know what's going to happen over the course of the next year. And so in the context of a downturn in the economy, a slowdown in some of our other revenue sources, there is a concern that not meeting our policy gets weighed against all of those other things. Now, conversely to that, is there a concern that we may experience a downgrade if we issue a judgment obligation bond? And of course, this is in the context of the city's history. The city does not borrow for operations. And even in the worst of times, there was a commitment not to deficit borrow, and it was very hard to not go for that temptation to do it, but you stood steadfast against that. If the city were to pursue a judgment obligation bond, it's connected to your last point, which it being sort of understood as we're facing circumstances today, but it's not the expectation that next year the same set of circumstances would be created, which would mean that the city would commit to appropriately fund our liabilities account. And given the trends that we've been seeing over the last few years, it's well over $100 million, somewhere between $100 and $120 million is what we would advise. So we're essentially bookending our effort to go to the market to deal with this liability. Now, there is a difference between borrowing for very specific cases versus borrowing for pensions. Okay, pensions are an ongoing obligation. The city has a commitment. That is, by no other way of putting it, that is deficit borrowing, because you're basically paying what the equivalent of your mortgage is with your credit card. A judgment obligation is not necessarily that, because there are discrete cases that have a beginning, middle, and end, where there's not one big case, as you pointed out. We're bundling a series of cases and then using that to maximize the time, effort, and money that it takes to go to the market. If it was $20 million, we would not recommend a JOB. It's too much work, it's too much money, the cost of issuance isn't worth it. It's when you're going for beyond $50 million that it makes sense. The last time we went to the market, and it was for the Mayday Melee, it was about $50 million at that case. It was for 2 cases. So we're recommending, our best professional advice is that we preserve the reserve fund, try to maintain it at 5%, and then in this one time, use a tool that we have. And I think we're talking to the bond rating agencies tomorrow. We will inform them of our advice and the direction that your committee makes and the mayor. And then I think within sort of our track record of being fiscally responsible, setting all our policies, I think the bond rating agencies will consider this an anomaly from the track record that you've established.
So, but again, sorry to belabor this, but why is it more advantageous for us to have that anomalous borrowing as opposed to having the anomalous drop below 5% in our reserve?
I
Why
think
is
it's
one better than
important
the other?
to answer that. I think it's important to understand how the reserve fund is used throughout the year. We're self-insured, and that self-insured is in essence the reserve fund. We don't go buy insurance products to cover our liabilities for the most part. And there's a few that we do, like we did for the Fig Plaza, but very little else. So the reserve fund is in essence our safety net for the fiscal year. So not only does it protect us from when liabilities exceed what's been budgeted, but it's also there to protect us when the revenues don't come in. Because if the revenues don't come in, you only have 2 options. You're either going to cut expenditures, and that could be a death by 1,000 cuts. And we've all been through those years where we had to cut expenditures, and then you're talking about, are we going to lay off employees? Are we going to cut, trim back on these services that have taken us so far, and so long to kind of get back to somewhat of a minimum base. Otherwise, what you have to finish the year and to close the year is your reserve fund. And so if the reserve fund falls precariously below 5% or below 5%, and if the revenues don't come in, then the only way we're going to be able to close the books on fiscal year 16-17 is by further taking funds from the reserve fund. And then you start 17-18 in a much worse position.
To put a finer point to it, if what we were confronting right now was all exclusively driven by the liabilities problem, then it would be a different conversation. Then maybe you say, okay, we'll borrow from our savings account to pay for this one-time cost. But we know it's being driven by 2 things, liability being a significant piece, but the other piece being revenues. And of course, the transfer is what it is. We're hoping that departmental receipts start picking up again so we don't confront a $71 million shortfall there. But it's going to take, there's no certainty of that. And so we're trying to minimize the things that we can't control. That is why, in this case, we're making that recommendation. And again, it's not in the tradition of this office to make these kind of recommendations. We wouldn't make it if we didn't believe that it was the most prudent, given all the options that are before you.
I've got more on some of the other things, but why don't we stick members with the JO bonds just for, have clarity of thought for a minute. Anybody else have questions on the judgment obligation bonds at the moment? I know you will, Mr. Wonder, right? Yeah, go ahead.
Couple. Well, before I jump into this, I know the chair took the opportunity at a moment to welcome you to your last Budget and Finance Committee meeting.
Properly.
Not properly.
I will another time.
Oh, yes, but I wanted to do the same. And you inherited a lot of challenges and helped us get through that for a long time. So I really appreciate not only your leadership, but your friendship. So thank you.
Same here.
And I thought that was important to say that before I get into this.
So wind up.
No. Wait for the drop. No. So, a couple things. I mean, turn it into the holiday conversation that I had over this with some people that don't necessarily follow city finance, and which is typically who I choose to spend most of my holidays with. But anyway, try to explain some of this to them. And it was an interesting conversation where it went. Because in hearing this, and it reminded me of that in this conversation, this dialogue, is that we're looking and viewing and treating it as it's defined, one-time money. Except we actually budget for claims and judgments every year. It's ongoing. I don't see next year having zero. I don't see the following year having zero. We just came out of several closed sessions that had many. We'll be here again next Monday and the following Monday. The truth of the matter is, no matter what the size of those claims, while it may be one-time money or not programmatic, it varies dramatically every year. But we also have a good idea in a sense of what's coming in. In this case, to sum it up easily, is to say that either it was misjudged or way underfunded, but certainly not just a one-time expense, if you will. From that perspective, it is ongoing. We're going to pay it every year, no matter what. We're going to have more. It's never ending. In a litigious society and where we're at, we're the deep pockets, we get sued for everything. So having said that, it is akin to me of putting the mortgage payment on a credit card. And I'm all for keeping the reserve fund at 5. Absolutely, without question. If this was 2 crises, we wouldn't even be having the question. We'd actually start looking at the Budget Stabilization Fund that has over $100 million in it. But because of the strings attached to that and the locks we put on it, we can't. Because we're not in that situation where we'd have to, fortunately. It's actually a good economy right now. It's not bad. So with all of that, that's not what got us here. What's gotten us here is not so much the claims or how large they are, is that we didn't fund them to where we should have. Now, having said that, if we didn't have the opportunity, if we didn't have, I'm just looking at some of your recommendations, if we didn't have the opportunity, and I'm not even sure that we still have to go through the process and be approved, I think, from the court to do this. And we were not going to touch the reserve under 5 or let it go under 5. We would consider and look at immediately sweeping or borrowing special funds from every special fund that we have. We would look at all the reductions in departments and expenses and contracts. We would do a lot of the things that perhaps are even being suggested or proposed in here that we haven't yet done. Some of the things we have, some of the things we haven't. For example, withdrawing in your very first recommendation of any new and unbudgeted spending proposals to be resubmitted. What's the calculation on that? Where are we at on that? How fast can we do it? The fact that we'd spend nearly $4 million in interest in what I would consider as bad debt to fund an ongoing expense that was just simply underfunded is $4 million in money that isn't going to go towards city services or fixing that other sidewalk that's going to cost us another $4 million from a trip and fall. So those are the concerns I have, is that we don't necessarily and often do this for a good reason. Most municipalities don't. We've received and achieved transparency and a credit rating because of your help and leadership. In doing so, I would think that this is probably one of the worst things we can do from my perspective. And we're not at the end. We're not off the cliff. We're not quite there yet. I think with our partners in labor, and they've done a great job at looking at some of the things that we've been able to do to create efficiencies. We've got to do that again. We should have immediate open dialogue, roundtable discussions with them, sitting here as we do for budget annually, because I know that they've been great partners in helping us find some of those dollars to get us through this. So for me, I think, I've shared this before. I have concern about setting that precedent. I don't think we've looked under every crack and crevice. I think there's some things here we just simply need to start looking at a little more. If we stick to the reserve at 5% and refuse to go under, and I'm a proponent for a minimum of 5. And if we are turned down by the courts to do this, what other options do we have?
I mean, you would basically rely on the reserve fund. That's really the only option left.
And if I could just state, we've already used the reserve fund this year to pay liabilities. In the first financial status report, we transferred $28.5 million from the reserve fund, and as we stated in the second FSR, we anticipate transferring another $23 million from the reserve fund to pay other liabilities as they come through Claims Board, Budget and Finance, and get approved by Council.
And so, like, just recommendation number 1 as an example, how much is that?
Recommendation number 1, it's really it's more of a cautionary and more of a principle statement, in that if we're dealing with deficits now, then departments should not be submitting any new requests that weren't part of their 16-17 budget, or
So why isn't, and that's looking at that, why isn't reducing any options, reducing any services, or we haven't had that discussion. We're simply we're talking about borrowing money to pay, again, what I've sort of, which is, we can call it what we want, but it's an ongoing expense. We're going to be in the same boat next week. We're going to be in the same boat next fiscal year. And those judgments are always a constant here. So it's not like buying a piece of equipment. It's not a new helicopter. It's every year.
No, to be clear, this is not a menu. We're recommending that all of these things
Right.
be done.
Right, but there's only dollar amounts to one of them. But
Right. Well, because that's the most tangible one, right? And so number 1 is about signaling to all departments. We ask that you not submit any new proposals. We know that they're being developed now. We hear about them.
Mm-hmm.
And so.
But why not reductions? Reductions in the city fleet. There's things we haven't done to tighten belt. Belt tightening are we've had those conversations before. And I'm not talking about managed hiring or layoffs. In fact, we already have an obligation, and that I supported in bringing services back, and still remain supported and committed to that. But there are other reductions we can take. And
the most obvious one to stop hiring, period. I mean, that's the biggest driver to our budget. And so basically put a freeze on hiring, and then including public safety, that would be the most obvious one to do. If the goal is to protect the reserve fund and not issue a judgment obligation bond, it's no different than the conversation we had several years ago. There's no magic here. I mean, to go through a budget cutting exercise, we could certainly go through that. That usually takes, as you've seen before, a couple months to proceed, and by the time it goes through the process and gets decided on, you're now down to the last few months of being able to generate savings. And so what we're proposing is all of these things, and to maintain a tool. I mean, if we wait longer to have this tool, then you don't have it. And so this is really an effort to try to maintain a tool to preserve the reserve fund, because we know we have a number of issues that are creating this tension, including our revenue.
And is there any reason for not looking at, it's not part of the instruction as well, on special funds and looking at
We
whether it's,
can't use special funds.
whether it's a borrow or a sweeping?
We're prohibited from using special funds for general fund purposes, and the controller has the ability to borrow from special funds, which he often does.
Right.
But up to a certain date, and that's usually, I think, mid-spring? And then at that point, he's prohibited from borrowing any from the special funds. The special funds all have to be made whole before the fiscal year's over.
Right.
So that's just part of the course to deal with our cash flow, that the controller has the ability to manage, to borrow from our special funds, which he does regularly.
Okay.
I wish we had other options here. Again, it's fair to end up at a different conclusion about this tension between the reserve fund and borrowing. I think, and if ultimately, if your council decides to move forward with it's more important to preserve, not to use that tool, I think that's a fair thing.
Well, have we considered going to every single department and saying, and I just don't know if this exercise has been done, because we've done it in the past, is to ask for a percentage of reduction and say, what would you do if you had to cut a certain percentage for reduction? And I'm not talking about staff necessarily, but there are other things that have been proposed in the past that we haven't looked at. Has that exercise been looked at?
No, we could do that.
Okay. No, that's all I got for now. Thanks.
So, but before I go to Ms. Martinez, I just a couple of comments on some of those points. I think the answer to the last question is yes, we have. For the last 5 years, we've been doing that. And we're just now emerging from the wreckage of that process and the reduction in city services that we've had through that process. So I don't want this discussion to suggest that, we've been asleep at the switch and haven't looked at cost reductions, because that's all that any of us have been doing since we've been on this committee. And and yet still we have remaining structural deficit that we still haven't fully erased. And part of the reason that we've done that cost reduction and that cutting and that pain over the few years is to build up this reserve fund to get to the point now so that we won't have to go through that exercise again. And the other point on this being one-time money, I appreciate that comment, and I'm still not clear on what the answer to that is, because Mr. Englander is right. Every year we're going to have, no matter what we do, there are going to be tens of millions of dollars of liability every single year. Because when you have a big operation of 30,000 plus employees and all kinds of operations and countless vehicles, and you're going to have a lot of liability. That's just, there's no way of avoiding that fact. But the amount of that liability is not necessarily an ongoing expense. Our mortgage payment is predictable. Our liability payments are not predictable, because every now and then you get a false imprisonment claim if somebody's been in prison for 25 years and you get a $40 million judgment or something. I mean, we get those things that are not predictable. But this comes back to my point, which is we have to have some trend lines to base whether that's one-time money or not. And as I sit here today, I'm still not clear on what that is. Now, I hear from you that going forward, the recommendation of the CAO's office is going to be significantly to increase that amount. And I hope that, that we will take a hard look at what are those trend lines, and do we expect this to be the new normal now? Because it wasn't. A few years ago, we weren't looking at $120 million in liability. It was a significantly lower number than that. So what are the new trend lines? Is this the new normal? And if it is, then we have to budget for it. And if we don't budget for it and we have a shortfall, we shouldn't be borrowing to cover that. So anyway, this is kind of
I think
nuanced point on that.
When the mayor releases budget, in our budget letter, this was the number one issue we cautioned about, that the liability account was going to be lower than what we expected. And it was, and so it's, and in fact, it ends up being true. I mean, we were concerned about it when the budget was
Yeah,
released.
I know, and you've been sounding that alarm for a while, but again, we've been, for as long as I've been on this committee, this has been the one part of the budget that has the least science
Yeah.
associated with it. I mean, in every area of revenues and costs, we can look at what the history has been, we can look at what the change in cost has been, we can look at the impacts of the overall economy, and we can say, okay, this is what it's likely to be, and you're usually pretty spot on in making those predictions. Liability is entirely unpredictable, but I think we could do a better job of looking retrospectively, both to determine where the trends are and also to look where the areas are where we, through risk management strategies, we can reduce that amount. And, you know, obviously we've all been working hard on those two goals, but we're not there yet in either of them to my
And if I could just offer a couple, you know, we did include as a companion recommendation, if you will, that if we issue this JOB, then we need to have that comprehensive review of existing cases so that we do budget in next year's, you know, liability accounts an amount that we feel will address that potential monetary liability that we have. But I do want to also state that we included a timeline of events if we get the direction to proceed. Even if you tell us, go proceed with the judgment obligation bond, we still don't necessarily have to issue.
Right.
You know, we don't have, you know, we get that direction. There might be some costs associated with going through the process, but, you know, when it comes to that day and whether or not we hit the market, we still reserve the right not to have to issue any bonds. And since that timeline shows us at that place in June, by then we'll know what we actually budgeted for 17-18. So if you want almost, you know, kind of reserve the right to not issue, you could give us direction to proceed with the process, and knowing what we actually budget in 17-18, then we'll know whether or not it makes sense to issue a JOB or not.
And I
Be another check before the
Yeah.
actual.
Yes.
And I would recommend adding Mr. Englander's recommendation to start looking at ways to reduce expenditures through an exercise that you instruct our office to pursue, to look at non-essential expenditures and come back within a few weeks with what that could potentially look like, with the objective of not having to issue the bonds, but trying to mitigate the shortfall in a different way.
Ms. Martinez.
Since we got these numbers so wrong this year, do we have a better grasp of what the expenditures are going to be in the incoming budget? Do you have a number? Are you going to still ask for 60, or do you think you're going to increase that amount?
Well, I think it's going to be more than 60. I mean, just based on the last 2 years that we've been dealing with this, and
But you have no idea what you're going to be requesting?
it requires that information that the chair has been talking about. You know, that review with the city attorney
So
of
we don't-
existing
so
cases.
we don't know that.
No, what we would recommend, and as we did in the last budget, is that it be twice as much as what's been budgeted, a minimum of 120 million. Ultimately, the mayor decides what's proposed in
Right.
his budget, and then the council approves that. But at this point, given the trend line, it would make sense to have
double it.
To double it. That's
And getting back to the GOBs, do we have an idea of what the settlement of judgments will be, or what we would be paying for?
So right now, what we've stated is that we would issue something in the range of $50 to $70 million. We just don't know how many cases
That's what I
we
wanted
can kind of incorporate into the issuance. We have been keeping the option open on some of the cases that have come before the.
So we don't know now what, if we were to issue the bonds, we don't know exactly which settlements we would be paying.
There's about 30 million that your council has the ability to use a judgment obligation bond based on the instruction that was given when you approved the settlement. So there are about four or five cases that your council has approved in the current fiscal year that would qualify. The total of that is about 30 million. There's another additional half a dozen cases or so that we see in the pipeline that we would recommend be considered for a total of somewhere between 50 and 70 million.
And what do we expect the payments to be? If we would go down this direction, and for how long?
Natalie Brill, CAO's office. If it's between 50 and 70 million, we'd probably be paying anywhere between 10 and 15 million dollars a year.
For how many years?
10 years. It's a 10-year bond. It's limited by state law. And then I think the councilman had asked the difference if we got downgraded. We did that analysis, and it's a cumulative $5 million a year extra if you go from a AA to an A across the board. So the first year would be $5 million. The second.
Say that again?
So we did an analysis that showed the difference between a AA and an A rating. Right now we're AA. So if you do go down to an A rating, the difference is $5 million a year for every bond issue cumulative. So if you issue 3 or 4 times a year, right, you would pay an additional $5 million for each of those bond issuance.
Per year.
Cumulative. Yeah, but it's cumulative. So the first year it's 5, and the second year it's 10, and the second year it's 15. That's today.
And that debt is more than 10 years usually. It's usually
Right.
30 million.
We're talking debt
Years.
between
30
20 to
years,
30 years, right? So the difference in the bond rating is significant. That's based on today's rates. That could change, but we did do that analysis.
I have another question. Did you want to follow up?
Just to follow up on that number.
Yeah.
Because it didn't make sense. Maybe my math in my head is not, $15 million on $50 million is 30% a year.
Okay, so let's back that up a little, because it's probably between 10 and 15 million. That's very conservative, right? You're talking about a 5.5% interest rate. That's what we do.
How does
little below-
$50 million a year at 5% a rate come to even $10 million? That's 20%.
Right, it's the way that the calculation is done, right? Because you have to add in costs, and you have to add in the way the formula is. That's the way it turns out to be. If you're Yeah, so right now, we have $50 million outstanding. The debt service is about $9 million a year, but interest rates are going up. We think that if it's a $70 million bond issue, we would pay about $9 million a year, because interest rates are going up.
But
That doesn't make any
I'm
sense.
sorry, my high school math is telling me that's still 15%.
No, it's
That's
not.
way above what a credit card costs.
You're talking principal and
There's
interest.
no loan out there in the
principal and
marketplace
interest.
that
It's
costs.
principal and interest.
Right, it's principal and interest,
Okay,
So you're
but
paying off
you're
your
amortizing
principal?
it over 10 years.
right,
It's for the full payment of the principal and interest.
right.
Okay, so 5 million amortized, 50 million amortized over
So it's
10
about-
years, it was 5 million in principal a year, plus the
Plus,
interest.
right, so it's about $9 million a year.
Okay.
It's $10 million a year.
So that's $4 million in interest, which is still almost 10%.
Right, but you're also dividing up the maturities, right? The 50 million that you're issuing, you're dividing it up over 10 years, right? So you have to pay back you have to pay back the principal, right? So you're paying $5 million a year in principal plus interest. And that's where the $4 to $5 million comes in.
What's
So-
the interest rate right now?
It keeps going up.
No, but what is
Yeah, I
right
mean,
today?
we
What
do
is
that
today
analysis
over-
based on 5.5%. That's the interest rate we use for everything that we do in the city, because we don't know where the interest is going to be. With the rates going up, rates have increased 120 basis points, 1.2% since November. So we have to be conservative, right? So we're telling you that if we think the interest rate right now is what used to be 3%, it's now closer to 4.5%.
Okay.
And you add in cost of issuance, right? So you're paying off principal and interest, Councilman.
I get it. The
So the
numbers still are
interest
not
is-
adding up to me.
It's still,
$4
No.
million on a $50 million
Right.
loan is 8%. Is it an 8% loan?
No, but you're
For
paying off
9%
principal and interest, so you're
No,
paying.
I already
That
subtracted
part.
that. It's $5 million in principal.
Right.
That's
So it's about
amortized
4
over
million,
10
so
years.
about $4 million in interest.
That's more than 5%.
Right.
Way more than 5%.
Oh.
It's almost 10%. $4 million
That's the way the
on-
formula works out. On all our bond
well, we need to
issues.
see your analysis. I'm glad I asked the question. Can we, you
Yeah, I
share
mean,
your
look,
formula with us?
we borrowed $20 million in 2009, and $20.6 million, right? The amount that we make in interest is $2.5 million, right? We borrowed $50 million in 2010, and $5.8 million in 2010. We're paying $6.5 million a year. because you're paying principal and interest
I get that. But the number that you just gave was $9.5 million a year
for $70 million.
for 70 million. Okay, for 70
Right.
million. So let's see.
Not 50.
So we got.
So 50 would be a
four-
little bit less. It'd be closer to like, right, it'd be closer to just $7 million a year. Because you're paying interest and principal.
I get it. I've already subtracted.
I mean, I don't have a debt service
Okay.
schedule in front of me,
At
unfortunately.
70 million at $4.5 million in interest for 70 million is still 6.5%. So I guess you're at 5% interest plus fees and plus these other things that
Yes.
you're talking about? Okay, so at 70%, it's a little closer to the ballpark. Okay. At 70 million. Okay, sorry.
My last question, since Mr. Englander had mentioned the Budget Stabilization Fund, so there's currently $93.9 million in that fund. Would it be prudent to take some of that money from that fund to lower the amount that we would have to take out in bonds? Or at this point, once you issue bonds, does it even matter what the amount is? It's all bad anyways.
I mean, it's the way that bond, excuse me, the way
I know
that
there's
that
limitations and stuff that was written into that
Yes.
fund, but I'm trying to figure out how do we, if we have to borrow, can we borrow less?
I mean,
Is there a way to make this work if we borrow from the fund so that we would have to borrow less and issue?
I'm not going to say that's not an option. That's always
it
an
is an
option because it's something that the council created, so it's something that the council can amend and change. But it was created in a way to prevent us from actually tapping into it during the year, so that we would have something there for the actual stabilization of the budget, and it's actually gets considered as really, the rules say that you can't tap into it unless the revenues of the economically sensitive revenues, and those are like property tax, business tax, sales tax, if they start falling below 3.4% or 3.3%. And so it's the council would really have to amend the entire structure of that fund for us to use it for this purpose right now.
So they're your rules, so you could choose to waive those rules. We would recommend against that. Because that's the equivalent of breaking the glass, the emergency glass. There's different things you do before you do that, and including the budget exercise that Mr. Englander suggested. But that's really intended for when we have a recession and we see revenues drop for reasons outside of our control.
Mr. Bonnet?
Just judgment obligation bond or other?
I tried to do that, but if you want to go into something else, that's fine. Too.
All right.
I'll come back to my other stuff.
I had more clarity on the judgment obligation bond before we started doing the math. So let me ask about a couple other things, because I'm really concerned by the situation we're in, and it's nice of you to have your tenure come full circle and
Nearly as bad as it was.
and as you began. But there's a couple things in here that concern me, different than what we've just been discussing. One of them is the short-term rental stuff, and for me, it's mentioned in there twice, even though it's specifically called out once. One is the asking for us to start negotiating fees from the other short-term rental companies. I get that. That's consistent with what we've done before. I was concerned when we did that before. I supported it, but I was concerned that if we did that, it was going to screw up coming up with a regulatory framework. Because my position has always been that the regulation should dictate the revenue and not vice versa. And what I see in 2B, holding in abeyance or disapprove any new policies under consideration that could further reduce current year general fund receipts, is that we're going to have to not approve a regulatory framework for short-term rentals, because a regulatory framework for short-term rentals will necessarily restrict the number of units that are currently being used. And that concerns the hell out of me, because a number of folks have been working for a very long time on that policy, and we're very concerned when we started making the deal with Airbnb. And I'm very concerned that if when this policy comes back, in a few months and gets through the committee process, we're going to be faced with, if we approve this, it's violating our policy because it'll have an impact on revenues, and it almost necessarily will.
To be clear, the objective on that point was to make a larger statement about other revenue sources. So there's been a conversation about to earmark certain revenues from Department of Transportation, right, that are general fund receipts, and to use those revenues for purposes of DOT-related activities. There's been a conversation about what to do with the waste franchise revenue. That's technically a general fund, but there's been a conversation about thinking about having those revenues fund a particular program. In this year's budget, there was a specific direction to earmark a part of the additional TOT for homelessness, and that obligation is going to be met. To the extent there's a larger conversation to do 100% of that revenue, when it exceeds that, in fact, it probably has already, to other programs, we would say, be mindful that you're basically eliminating the general fund sources. So it wasn't a specific recommendation on short-term rentals. It was just advising that as you look at specific revenue streams, be mindful that every time you direct those revenues for a particular program, you're making less funding available for the bigger general fund.
Well, presumably we'd be mindful of that anyway.
Yeah, but there are current active conversations taking place to divert those revenues. And in this particular context, where we're facing a shortfall, where there is revenue is one of the reasons why we're facing that shortfall, we would recommend putting those conversations in abeyance until the budget.
So what would 2D do to a current conversation that says there is a 40-unit building in Venice that used to be primarily affordable or rental housing, where most of the tenants have been evicted, and they're now being used as short-term rentals. It's a rogue hotel, Ellison Apartments, and they're presumably paying TOT. And if we say that you can only, as the policy envision says, you can only legally rent as a short-term rental your primary residence, that says you can't be operating that rogue hotel, that'll impact revenue on it.
That wasn't the intent.
Yeah. So
the intent is once that revenue for those eligible units comes in, it comes in as TOT, and so TOT is general fund, as opposed to coming in as a special fund that gets put somewhere else and not the general fund. So what we're saying is you could have your regulations and limit what units are considered to be rentable as short-term rentals, and if that's limited, that's the decision and the policy. But once that revenue comes in, it comes in as regular old TOT, and the regular old TOT gets budgeted by you all through the budget process.
So it wasn't intended to comment or to give any recommendations or direction on the discussion specific to short-term rentals.
No, I get that it wasn't intended to, but
and so it would. It was the purpose is really about the revenue. That's reflective of whatever policy your council adopts.
I get it wasn't intended to, but we do all sorts of things that have unintended consequences, and I'm just seeing that as one of them. The other question I had, I got two more. One is under Section 1, I'm just curious on this. You've got A, which is withdraw any new and unbudgeted spending proposals. Got it. Well, let me ask. Would that have any implication under the homelessness budget for establishing the safe parking program where an RFP just went out on this a couple weeks ago?
If it was budgeted, then no, it would not have an impact.
Would it have an impact on, say, the RFP comes out and it says this is actually going to cost us $5 million more than we anticipated? does 1A preclude us from finding somewhere else in our homelessness appropriation to fund that?
I mean, we would normally, even without this policy, my office would try to identify as many sources as possible to mitigate that shortfall, including if there's another homeless program that isn't spending,
Right.
not likely to spend, we may recommend that move these dollars that were intended for this purpose to meet this additional need that wasn't anticipated, all within the context of homelessness.
Okay. 1B says, tell the departments to make any adjustments, mitigate their own shortfalls within existing departmental resources, inclusive of adjusting their hiring plans for the year. And then the second one says, basically hold the line on any positions vacant until mid-year financial status report, unless they're special funded. B is sort of like telling the general managers you're on a 1,500 calorie a day diet. And C is basically telling them how many servings of protein they can have. If they're keeping to 1,500 calories a day, why do we care how many servings of protein they have?
Because we're trying to do belts and suspenders. I mean, it's again, recognizing that there's, why it's not dire, it's serious, and that we're hoping that your council would reinforce the need to keep hiring at the bare minimum. There's no enforcement here, if you can tell. So this is basically an element of the council stating its intent and concern, and so each department will be regulated through through the normal processes of that.
Okay. Final one is, and this is one where it's really not a question, it's more a statement on my part. I'm not voting for anything that gives us one more billboard or weakens billboard regulations. So I'll either be against or we can bifurcate, but I can't support 2B and the CAO's policy on that. I think there's some potential ways to do billboards in the city, but the CAO policy as it is not one I'm comfortable with. I've seen a proliferation of billboards over my years in the city due to some bad policy decisions. I think the framework we have now is one which allows us to make a clear, legally defensible distinction, and I think the idea of going outside of the special districts is incredibly problematic, so I'm not down with the CAO recommendation. So you helped me think through some of the others, but on this one, don't even bother trying. I'm not open on that one.
Well, let me ask just one follow-up question on that then. Because there's been so much discussion and controversy and debate over billboards and particularly digital billboards. Assuming that there were going to be some kind of proposal, the one that would be that would prevent proliferation of billboards the most and would produce the greatest revenue to the city would be a public-only option. Is that not right?
Yes.
Okay. So if the public property-only option had a private component added to it, that would both add to the potential number of billboards and reduce the revenues available to the city. Is that your
Yes.
analysis? Okay.
And
Assuming that something were to happen.
And that's on a separate track. I mean, and it's in the committees for the policy discussion. Well, the reason it's here is that we were actually trying to identify ways to generate revenue in a process that we can control.
Right.
And so the most appropriate thing would be to kick it back to the policy discussion because it has policy implications. But as the city starts trying to identify new sources of revenue that don't require a vote of the people, this is one option, and certainly my office could continue to pursue others.
Great. And just further follow-up to Mr. Bonnett's very specific questions about 1A and what would be impacted and what would not. I think the import of this is really that if anyone is going to propose a new program, they should do it in the context of the ordinary budget process for next year's budget, when we can debate fairly and openly what are the trade-offs, what are the revenue sources, what services are going to be cut in order to pay for that new program, and so on. That's the thrust of this,
That's
is
correct.
it not? And if the council were to adopt this recommendation, certainly because we're adopting this recommendation, if there were an emergency issue, if there was something urgent that required action in this year, whether it was a new program or an existing program, we'd still have the option to do that. But the assumption would be that any new programs should be deferred until the ordinary budget deliberation for next year.
That's exactly what we're recommending.
Mr. Blumenfield.
Yeah, and following up on the same point, I had the same issue with the billboard. Wanted to understand what exactly we're being asked to vote on today in terms of the billboard policy, because I'm not ready to vote on that billboard policy, but I wasn't necessarily, it was a little ambiguous to me about what supporting the CAO recommendation actually means.
So we had issued a separate report, the council file is referenced, to pursue a program of billboards on city-owned land. And so the city could generate revenue through that process. It takes about a year and a half to go through a procurement process to pursue it. I think it's currently sitting in plum committee for consideration.
This could be convention center, this could be any type of property.
Well, the convention center is separate because there's certain limitations around it, given easements and rights that AEG has. But basically, we would identify, there's actual maps. If you look at the council file, there's actual, some homework that was done as to where that could potentially be. And so to launch that procurement process, we would need direction from your council. But the policy piece of this conversation is already sort of on its way. We're just pointing out that in the context of a shortfall, not just for this year, but in the future, that if in fact we're trying to identify billboards as a potential source of revenue for the city to help mitigate budgetary priorities that your council may have, we're advising that direction be given to our office so we can begin that process.
I guess I want to make it real clear, because what I don't want to read is articles tomorrow in the newspaper saying, if we were to adopt this, saying that we have adopted a billboard policy to fund our budget.
Correct.
And I'm very worried because I've already seen articles to that effect.
But if you do write that, record Bonin as a no vote.
I in no way am supporting adopting a billboard policy here in this committee to fund our budget. I don't think anyone here is doing that, and I want to be very explicit in saying that. As far as I'm willing to go is if you're talking about looking into, authorizing you to look into the policy on various public properties, but any decision like that has to come to council. There's not going to be a billboard that will be put up pursuant to any action that we're taking today. We are not banking on any dollars that are being put into this today. I'm being super explicit because I've already seen it being misinterpreted. So please clarify that I'm saying an accurate assessment of what you are asking us to vote on or not vote on.
So as part of the council file that's referenced, there's a series of actions that need to take place. There's a procurement process that needs to be commenced. The tool for that procurement process would be presented to your council for approval. After, if your council were to approve it, then the procurement process begins. Before a single billboard goes up, then it comes back to your council for a description of who the partners would be and their approaches to it, including where they would propose issuing billboards, the kind of billboards, how much revenue would be generated. There would be multiple ways in which this issue would come before your council should there be authorization to begin this process. And so the reason it's here is to try to identify ways in which the city could generate revenue. Obviously, for this fiscal year, even if the policy were to be approved, or direction rather, to begin the process, it would not mitigate this year's shortfall because it takes, like I said, about a year and a half to go through that process. But
And the action we're taking is not to approve that policy anyway. You're just saying this is just to look into various sources of revenue. I mean, it doesn't even need to be on this page to do that, does it? I mean, do you really need additional authorization to start the process to look into this, given that it's already in policy committee?
well, it's already the policy committee. We just need direction from that committee. So it's tying it. It's looking at it from two different perspectives. One from the policy, which is on its way, and also from the fiscal perspective, which is under your bailiwick.
But it's not authorizing.
Correct.
Okay, I just want to be very clear about that. And then as far as other questions, back to the GEO bond issue we were starting to talk about, I look at it as what I'm hearing from you is that we have an extraordinary liability obligation this year compared to previous years. Is that, and obviously there's two ways, and the problem that we have generally with this liability is we have these peaks and we have these valleys, and we haven't done a very good job of predicting the through line. And a GEO bond is one way to smooth that line out, is basically by borrowing for 10 years, and you smooth out the peak and valley that way. A more prudent approach to smoothing out the peaks and valleys, in essence, is to do it in advance, in terms of through having some sort of a rainy day fund for liabilities, where we put aside, we have an estimated percentage, and we're putting aside X times 1.1 times X for each year. So we're putting aside a certain additional amount, and then we're basically we're cutting off the peaks and filling in the valleys in advance. But we can't go back in time to do that. So I would say if we're going to do something like this, where we're trying to smooth out the unpredictable trend line, that we take that action, if we as distasteful as it is to do, but we see where we are and what our choices are, sort of a Hobson's choice, but that we at the same time initiate a policy to do it in advance and make sure that as we go each year that we're putting aside more than we expect, whether it's into a fund or into a theoretical fund, so that we smooth that trend line out to deal with what is unpredictable. I mean, having cases come up from 20 years ago that we wouldn't have expected is not predictable. It is predictable, as my colleague is pointing out. Every year we're going to have liability, and to assume otherwise would be foolhardy. But
in the past, we've relied on the UB account that's put aside every year, and we always fight for the biggest UB account possible to avoid this situation. And so, in addition to doubling the budget for liabilities, I would recommend that your council continue to be in the practice of having a reasonable size UB account to help mitigate exactly these kinds of shortfalls throughout the year, which act exactly what you said as sort of a protection for the uncertain.
would you recommend identifying sort of a portion of the UB account as a rainy day fund for liabilities?
Well, it could be all of it. I mean, it's just based on what happens every year, so you have flexibility throughout the year. If the budget is twice as big as it is 60 million to 120 million, then the need to rely on the UB significantly reduces. I mean, but these are all trade-offs, as Mr. Krikorian mentioned. I mean, it means you have less things to fund during the budget.
And then the question, the bigger question, I ask this probably on every FSR, we talk about the structural deficit versus the one-time deficit and trying to get a handle on that, because as we all, good financial practices is we shouldn't be borrowing for a structural deficit. We should be solving structural deficit and then dealing with the one-time deficits. Do we have a better grip in terms of what is, of the $245 million budget, how much of that is truly structural and how much is one time? And I know part of the difficulty is that is this very question of the liabilities in terms of what is structural and what is one time. But
Well, the part of what created the deficit was that our property tax receipts came in the last fiscal year. And so we're now seeing a pattern where that's occurring year after year. So this year, one of the solutions could be if that actually happens again next year, the 35 million of the property tax receipts actually come in the current fiscal year versus next year, which would help us close the gap this year. But that means you have less revenue next year. So that means one way of addressing this problem into the future, as an example, is that we not budget, we assume it's going to happen, and we expect it, so that means next year's projected revenue for property tax would be less, but it also means that this year, it's a structural change. There's pieces of our shortfall that are created as a result of, the reduction in the transfer. That's unlikely to be an ongoing reduction to the transfer. So,
but that's predictable now. I mean,
yeah, there's a low predictability, so that's a structural problem.
So on the expenditure side, part of the deficit that we've reported is tied to labor agreements that have been approved. So, those labor agreements are ongoing. So, those are structural issues that we've always known we'll have to address as part of the budget.
I mean, obviously, we want to get the structural portion of this handled yesterday. I mean, we're very fortunate. This is the 75th month of straight economic growth. It's unheard of, and we know that signs are already there. That's turning around. We're going to move toward recession sooner than later. And we want to make sure we're positioned for that. And so it's very concerning where we're at. But that's it.
All right, members, anything else? I think it's worth sort of closing on the thought that as much as this has been a difficult conversation, and as you're absolutely right, Mr. Blumenfield, there's a lot of reason to be concerned, as we always should be. If this committee isn't concerned every year, then we're not doing our job. But on the other hand, we're also discussing here, we're arguing over whether we maintain our 5% reserve.
Much better.
A reserve that was never achieved in the modern history of this city until the last few years. So, you got to put it into a context too. We have a problem to solve this year. It's a solvable problem. These recommendations, I think, help us get towards that. We've unquestionably achieved much stronger budget discipline than we've ever had. In recent years, even in these difficult times, we've built a more positive relationship with our labor partners, I think, that has brought us to a point now where we actually are restoring services, and we're focusing on hiring new people in targeted areas where we can grow again. So there's a lot of good that has to be brought into this discussion to sort of help to focus our attention on the little bit of, I shouldn't say the little bit, but the challenges that we still have to meet. They're not unquestionably challenges. And for as much progress as we've made, this is not the time to throw out everything we've done for the last 4 years and start spending like drunken sailors, obviously. But on the other hand, you introduced yourself as Debbie Downer, and maybe you are. Maybe that's your job. Maybe that's what you should be. But the truth is, there's an awful lot of good things to say about the work that we've done, and these are challenges that pale in comparison to what we faced 3 or 4 years ago, to be sure. So anything else, members, on this? I think because there are a variety of recommendations, and we've heard a variety of views on this, I know several members expressed recommended changes, but members have also expressed discomfort with one or the other of these recommendations. So what I'm going to suggest is that first of all, if you wish to add a recommended amendment, Mr. Englander had a few. I'd ask you to recite those again, Mr. Englander, and anybody else who wanted to add a caveat to these recommendations. And then what we'll do is we'll ask if you want to if you want to vote, if you want to vote separately on any of these recommendations, let me know what those are so we can pull them out for a separate vote. We'll then vote collectively on the remainder, and then we'll take separate votes on those that have been called out separately. Does that make sense? Okay. So, Mr. Englander, why don't you start with what you had said again? I know that you wanted to ask the departments for cost reduction recommendations.
Yeah,
Maybe
go
you
through
could
that
more
exercise.
explicitly.
It's essentially ask every department citywide for budget reduction suggestions in an exercise in contract and expense reductions, as well as recommendation to look at the appropriate amount of, you mentioned special funds, but we have a drop-off, so I think it'd be appropriate for the controller perhaps to address that as well and to come back with that as soon as possible.
Okay. Anything else, members? All right. So, so the judgment obligation bond issue is 3A. We'll vote on that one separately. Mr. Bonin had indicated a desire to vote on 2B separately. The TOT is short-term rentals issue. Is that? Are you okay with that?
I'll be okay with 2A. I'd like to vote separately on 2B and 2D
Okay.
and 1C.
So 1C, 2B, and what else?
2D.
Okay. All right. So, anything else, members, for separate vote? All right.
I'm sorry,
So we have 1C,
2D, 2B, and 3?
2B as in boy, and 2D as in dog,
David,
and 3A.
3A, okay.
Okay, so excluding those items, is there any objection to approval of the remainder of those items as amended by Mr. Englander? Seeing.
Chair, will you be taking public comment today?
No, public comment was already closed, Mr. President.
It's 2:05.
I'm sorry, you're disrupting the meeting. Will there be any other objection to those? Okay, so those recommendations will be approved. That brings us then for a separate vote on item 1C, the recommendation for civilian vacancies, prioritizing and expediting the hiring of specially funded positions, and so on. So, is there any objection to that?
On that one, I think 1B is enough. I think the belt is enough, so I'm going to vote no on the suspenders.
Okay. Is there anybody else who wishes to vote no on that? Okay, then it will be the action of the committee to approve item 1C on a 4-to-1 vote with Mr. Bonin a no. Item 2B, adopting the series of recommendations proposed by the CEO regarding regulation of billboards and so forth, with the clarifications so aptly provided by Mr. Blumenfield that this does not advance a policy. This is merely to, have a look at the budgetary impact of this, as was articulated by Mr. Santana. Is there
a way to reframe it and say adopt a series of recommendations? I guess just the way it looks makes it, as much as we say that, I'm just worried about the way it looks.
How about if we add at the end there with the development of a comprehensive policy subject to approval by the council? Okay. So that there's no question that is not yet approved. It's okay?
I'm still a no. I don't even want to think about it.
You would be. All right. Is there anybody else who's going to be off of that?
Bright lights, a no.
All right. So without further objection, item 2B will be approved by the committee with a 4-to-1 vote with Mr. Bonin no. That brings us to item 2D, hold in abeyance or disapprove any new policies under consideration that could further reduce current year general fund receipts. That was a no for Mr. Bonin. Are there any other no's? Seeing none, it'll be the action of the committee to approve that with a 4-to-1 vote with Mr. Bonin a no. And then 3A, and by the way, because I muddied the water on this, the reason that I couldn't figure that interest is because I was assuming the low ball 50 million and you were assuming the high ball 70 million. So it makes a little bit more sense now that you've clarified that. So thank you. So item 3A, approval of the instructions to proceed with the judgment obligation bond issuance. Mr. Englander, your no on this? Are there any other no's on this? Seeing none, it'll be the action of the committee to approve 3A on a 4-to-1 vote with Mr. Englander recorded as the no. Anything else? Anything else to be discussed on this?
Just
Yeah,
one
Mr. Blumen.
minor thing. Making sure the CAO is letting the folks other than this budget committee and communicating maybe on the policy committees about the issues we've raised in terms of spending. How is that done, other than assuming everybody listens to every word we say here?
Well, the report will go to full council for full council approval. And the next opportunity to get an update on this conversation is the mid-year FSR, which is coming when in February, March.
It would be before council goes on recess.
And so at that point, this helps. The reason why this is important now is because it helps frame what the mid-year FSR will look like. Because now there's a point of reference to see where things are based on the actions that were taken. And so certainly another practice that this office has done is issue a communication to all general managers, letting them know that this is in fact been the action of the council, should the full council adopt it, and that could be copied to all council members as well.
Okay. All right. Is there any other action before the committee? All right. In deference to Mr. Previn, without objection, members, I will reopen general public comment so that he can offer general public comment if he would like. But would you like to offer general public comment, Mr. Previn? Even though that was closed, I'm willing to extend you that courtesy.
Is that a yes or a
Thank
no?
you. Thank you.
Thank you, bye.
What's that? Yeah. No, you can't. Yeah. It's your discretion, sir, if you'd like to.
My name is Eric Previn, and I'm a resident of CD2, and I'm running for the office of Mayor of Los Angeles. I wrote an article in the New Year's Day edition of the Daily News about a Supreme Court case that we won against the county to disclose their legal bills to make it so that the public has a view on some of these escalating liability issues that face jurisdictions like the City of Los Angeles and the County of Los Angeles. You are, by moving forward in this way, by denying me access to the item when I was here for over an hour, escalating your own liability once again. You have been sued by people who participate in local government regularly, and your position has always been, with Mr. Fuhr's assent evidently, to simply squelch and do the wrong thing. This is exactly the kinds of difficulties that keep the city in this precarious position. I feel some sympathy for this body, but it is your own failure to allow the public in, which is clarified in that article that I wrote with my brother Joshua, that makes it easier for jurisdictions to hold the line on these escalating and repetitive retaliation lawsuits. Chief Beck in 2011 was bringing in a specialist to shut down this endless supply of retaliation lawsuits. Why have we not done that? Where are we going, and why is this escalating endlessly without anybody knowing that independent living was denied for 5 or 6 years any kind of action by the body to fix the liability for handicapped people, and instead, in fact, it escalated to a $225 million lawsuit with a $16 million attorney fee that had to get a separate bond just for the attorney fee in December.